Recording started.
Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us for our 5th Teaching is the Core webinar. This webinar is going to focus on rubrics and other scoring methods. It's going to be led by Dr. Sue Brookhart, and my name is Juliet Lyons-Thomas. I'm a fellow for the Regents Research Fund. I'll sort of do administrative duties, introductions, and at the end I'll say a few words, but Dr. Brookhart, who is an internationally known classroom assessment expert, is going to be leading us through the webinar today. Just a few words about norms before we get started. You may have noticed that your phone has been placed on mute upon entering the webinar. That's just to cut down on background noise. If you do have a question, instead of unmuting yourself, please type in your question to the chat box, and then we'll address it at a designated time. Do note that the default of your chat is to send it probably to the host of the webinar, but I'll need you to change that to send it to everyone. So just select everyone and then send your message. At the end of the webinar, we're going to ask you to fill out a survey based on your experience, and I do ask that you take just a minute to do that. It's about 3 questions, and it's really helpful to us to know what we did right and also what sort of topics you would like elaboration on for future webinars. Okay, so just to touch on the learning outcomes very briefly, by attending this webinar, you should be able to learn to create or select or adapt rubrics that match the intended learning outcomes. Participants should be able to learn to check for consistency among scorers. And also, we want participants to be able to learn how to use things like checklists, rating scales, and point schemes for special purposes. So with that, I'm going to pass the reins to Dr. Brookhart. And Dr. Brookhart, you should see that you're getting presenter privileges now.
I see it. Thank you very much, Juliet.
Sure.
If it actually works. There, it did work. Well, thank you again for joining us. Those of you who were participants in webinar number 2 will remember we did talk a little bit about rubrics when we talked about performance assessment. Because a performance assessment has 2 parts, tasks and rubrics. We spent most of the time on tasks. We did talk about rubrics, and we sort of ended up with the slide you see here, that in order for a performance assessment to tap the right learning outcome, both the task and the rubrics that are used to score it have to go after that. Doesn't do any good to have a beautiful example of student thinking in an essay or a report and then score it with things that just give points for how many facts they had. The fact that there was thinking in it just sort of disappears, and when the task goes home with the students, you're left with a rubric that doesn't mean anything about thinking, just about a list of facts. So we did talk about that much, and this webinar is supposed to take off where we ended up in the last time we talked about rubrics. We also talked about the criteria a little bit. Criteria are important for all scoring methods, not just rubrics. They're what connects student performance to the learning outcomes that they indicate. So when you think about writing a task, you also have to think about what am I going to look for in the student work that will let me know that this student did or didn't, or to what degree accomplished the learning outcome. Writing good criteria is something that people find sometimes harder than writing a good task. Oops, jumped one. There we go. For rubrics, there are 2 parts, criteria and performance level descriptions. So for rubrics, you not only have to say, what am I going to be looking for, but also, can I describe what that criterion looks like at all levels of work from good to poor. We have had some examples of those, and I'm going to give you some new examples this time. Here's an example of a pretty good one, and I'm using it as an example here because I think it clearly shows you what the difference is between a criterion and a performance level description. When you have students in a chorus, a school chorus, sing, they need to sing. My dad would have said, sing pretty. Well, what does it mean to sing pretty? It means your notes are accurate. It means you're singing the words so that people can understand them. It means that you're singing the parts correctly. It means that the tone quality of the sound you produce is of quality, and it means that you're interpreting the music well. And all of those criteria can be described on continua from not very good at all to excellent. Notice that the descriptions are literal descriptions. It doesn't say excellent, it says always on pitch. It doesn't say great rhythms, it says the rhythms are correct. So that's a pretty good example of what we're looking for in criteria and performance level descriptions. In webinar 2, we went through several exercises to actually critique criteria and performance level descriptions. And so I'm going to assume that some of you have figured that out, and I'm not going to go back over that. I'm going to launch into some examples, and I'm going to start with the counterexample, because there's nothing like a really bad example to make people groan first and then say, oh, I see why I shouldn't do it that way. So you're looking at the good example, and in a minute, with fear and trembling, I'm going to put up the bad example. And I have also some student work that goes with this bad example to show you how when you don't have criteria and performance level descriptions that meet the characteristics that we talked about in webinar 2, that they're descriptive, that they describe the work, that they match back to the learning outcomes, all that stuff, that you actually harm students, which just breaks my heart. And usually by the time I see the examples, the student's already been harmed. So this is the first one for you. Take a look at this rubric. I'm telling you, it's a bad rubric. What do you notice about it that you think should be changed, should be different? Take a look at the criteria and the performance level descriptions, and use your chat box set to everyone to tell us what you notice about this. This was a rubric for a report on a biome that I think it was seventh graders, yes it was, had to prepare. They got to pick which biome they wanted to report on. They made a report, and this is how the reports were graded. I'm going to wait a minute for some comments. What do you notice about the criteria, and what do you notice about the performance level description? I love it. From Catherine Cook to everyone. Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, yes, yes. It's just a lot. It's basically the directions in chart form, several of you now. Teresa Gray, Lori Gregory, thank you. It's basically the assignment sheet turned into a chart. What the students were supposed to be learning, now, it's not the greatest assignment in the world. Just go look up a biome and write a report about it. But even giving them the benefit of the doubt, the teacher intended for the students to learn some things about what a biome is, what their particular biome was like. And what they're getting their points for are, do they have enough of certain kinds of facts? Do they have pictures? Is their grammar right? And if you notice, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 criteria, which is an awful lot. And if you count how many are actually about what the students learned about biomes, it's hard to justify any of them. Some of them are about facts, but students can copy, especially now with electronics, they can copy facts into a report without actually passing them through their brains. So yes, indeed, that's what's wrong with this rubric. And the performance level descriptions are a lot of numbers as well, not necessarily quality descriptions. So for instance, the report contains 5 pictures, 3 or 4 pictures, 1 to 2 pictures. Well, are they appropriate pictures? Do they really illustrate anything? That's what you should be judging if you're judging the quality of the work. So what happens when you apply a bad rubric like this to student work? What I have is 2 examples. These are 7th grade learning support students who are in the regular 7th grade class, and I have their examples of their report. I know that the print is small and you won't be able to read too much of it, but this is the report from student A. The teacher liked student A's report. Student A did a report on the temperate forest, and the first sentence reads, the temperate forest is often called the deciduous forest. Then it goes on to describe a temperate forest type climate, and it has pictures and it has a cover. And the teacher graded that report this way. Because it had all its required elements, it had facts about biomes, it had pictures. The grammar was not too bad in the counting sense. Now, before we go on to see the poor student who didn't do so well, take a look back at the actual work itself. Notice that there are 2 paragraphs, a map, and some pictures. The 2 paragraphs aren't very long. They are accurate. If you could read them, you would notice they are accurate. And they do appear to be the student's own words. Now let's take a look at what happens in that rubric when a student doesn't follow the directions so well. This one has a map. It's about temperate grasslands. The first sentence is, temperate grasslands are characterized as having grasses as the dominant vegetation. Now the teacher didn't seem to think that wasn't, did seem to think that was in the student's own words. Sounds a little bookish to me, but notice how much is there. 2 fairly long paragraphs. What was missing was the pictures and some of the other bits of directions. So this poor student who wrote more and more detailed than the first student failed. Because they didn't see all of the fair and poor circles there for things like their pictures and their grammar and how attractive it was. Now, if you think about what the report was supposed to be about, you could make a case, if you actually could read that small print, that student 2 knew more about temperate grasslands than student 1 knew about the temperate forests. and yet student 1 got excellent reviews and student 2 failed. The problem was the rubric. But the teacher and the student didn't know that. The teacher thought this is all the stuff I asked the kid to do, so this is all the stuff I ought to check on. And the student, I'm sure, didn't think to question it. So now we have a student with an F in a column called Science who actually knows more science than a student with an A in a column called Science. That's not only not fair and not good information, it doesn't do anything to encourage the second student to continue to learn about science. And if you're using these sorts of things for judging how well a teacher taught, what the teacher didn't teach student 2 was how to get pictures, which is neither here nor there for learning about science. Now, I'm making a big deal about this because I see rubrics like this all the time. The good thing about this example is I actually have the student work so you can show how if your rubrics are like this and just count a bunch of things and give credit for bits of directions and not true criteria about content knowledge and skills, that you end up with information that doesn't mean what you think it means, and it hurts people. If you were the teacher being judged by this, it would look like you didn't teach one of your students very much about biomes, and that's not the case. What you didn't teach them was to follow directions, or maybe they didn't have a magazine to cut up or something. You don't know why they didn't put pictures in. I would suggest if you get if you want pictures and you don't get them, that you simply say, could you put some more pictures in this? And help the students see where they could do that. All right, soapbox over. Examples like this just hurt me in my heart because this is not okay for this student. Click, there we go. For that student who wrote all that, this is a 7th grade labeled special education student who wrote, 200 words? On the right topic with the right facts. And he's been told he doesn't know anything. That is not okay. So how are we not going to be this person? Well, because I already thought, and it was true, you did know what should go in the rubrics, quality, not quantity, and a limited number of criteria, you don't need 9 of them, that exactly match what you're looking for. I thought I'd go with some examples of different kinds of rubrics because they don't all look alike. It partly depends on the kind of work you're doing. So sometimes rubrics can be very concrete. They can be about parts of the assignment, and that's not a bad thing if what you want them to know is that the student can do certain things that can be parsed into parts. So here's a 3rd grade example. The students were trying to learn that multiplication can be expressed in at least 4 different ways. It can be a repeated addition problem. It can be a picture with equal groups. It can be an array, or it can be an actual multiplication problem with a multiplication sign in it. They were doing these as posters, and this is a good example of what came up. This student did 9 times 3 equals 27 for her fact. I'm saying her because of the hearts. I assume that's a girl. I don't actually know. I got this from the teacher, not the student. I do realize that her groups, she actually illustrated 3 times 9, but we'll cut her that slack. She has expressed this problem 4 different ways. And the teacher had a rubric that was really simple, but it did what it needed to do. And I'm going to show it to you now. Keep that picture in your mind. Now, in this case, the multiplication problem, repeated addition problem, picture with equal groups, and array are not just counting things. Those are the concepts they were supposed to learn. And each one has a little continuum that basically is completely correct, partially correct, or not correct. And that's what that's what the teacher needed to look for. Notice that in there, there's nothing about it's neat. There's nothing about clever choice of the groups. This little girl used hearts. They didn't have to use hearts. There's nothing about the colors they used. It's about the math. Was it correct? And were all of the 4 different concepts illustrated? And that's all it needed to do. So that when one didn't, like this one, if you look at it carefully, this kid sort of had the idea, but didn't quite manage to get the right number of counters or stars or plus signs, I'm not sure what those little things are supposed to be, in all his groups. So that the multiplication problem was okay. 10 times 8 is, in fact, 80. But the picture ones, if you actually counted them up, there aren't 80 things there. And they're not all arranged in nice little parallels. So, but this student, as you can tell, even though it's not terrific work, it's not artistically at the level of the other, the math is almost there. Clearly, for instance, the student was going for 10 groups of 8 here. You can see the 10 groups. It's just that if you count inside, he didn't actually get 8 in all of them. So there was no no points lost for not being neat. There was no points lost for some of those lines are in the array are not exactly parallel. It was just the point where he didn't actually put 8 little stars in each of the groups. And, of course, he would have had to have 10 groups of 8. So he didn't do as well as the first student, but not terrible. And if you look at the work, that's a reasonable reflection of what the student actually did. So that's an example of a nice, concrete rubric that is okay because the concrete pieces are the concepts that you're looking for. So let's look at what happens when you have more complex tasks. If you have more complex tasks, you want several criteria. They won't be parts of the problem like the last example. You'll either consider them one at a time, and that'll be analytical rubrics, or you'll consider all the criteria simultaneously and call them holistic rubrics. It is a misconception to say that holistic rubrics are just one scale or one criterion. It's one scale, but for each of the levels, you do consider all of the criteria. The criteria should be about qualities that the work exhibits and not about the directions, and I won't belabor that because clearly those of you listening had already remembered that from webinar 2. And I'm going to give you an example here. And this is a National Council of Teachers of Mathematics math problem solving rubric. It's not the most complicated one I ever saw. To be honest, I picked a simple one to fit on a slide and to be something that we could use easily that wasn't too complicated. If you have with you the pack of rubrics that Vicki sent out earlier today, this is example number 1. And if you would pull it out now, you'll still have the rubric in front of you as I move on to the example problems that I want you to score with it. And while you're getting that out, let me tell you a little bit about the characteristics of this rubric. So this is about math problem solving, which when I was in school amounted to getting the right answer. But getting the right answer, as the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics has known for years, is not the only outcome of solving a math problem. It's very important, though. You have to get an answer and correctly label it. And so that is a criterion. Sometimes in math problem solving rubrics, this is called computation. Sometimes it's called getting an answer. But there are 2 other rubrics here, understanding what the problem is asking you and then figuring out how to solve it or planning a solution. Those three taken together, understanding the problem, planning the solution, and getting an answer, are a nice description of what high-quality problem solving looks like. And then if you look at the performance level descriptions, they just work that out into 3 levels, from complete and correct understanding to not, or missing, or no attempt, or inappropriate. Notice that in the planning a solution rubric, the top description is plan could have led to a correct solution if implemented properly, which disentangles it from getting an answer. If the student, for instance, multiplied the right 2 numbers to get the right answer but just multiplied wrong, they can still get credit for having the right plan even if they had a computational error. Okay, I'm hoping that you're going to be able to continue to look at that rubric while I move on to a problem and some student work that I'm going to ask you to score with that. So here's the problem. It's a combinations and permutations problem. Jan's Snack Shop has 3 flavors of ice cream: vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. The ice cream can be served in a dish, a sugar cone, or a regular cone. So it's a 2-part problem. One part is there are 9 people who choose 1 dip of ice cream in a dish or in a sugar cone or in a regular cone, and all of their choices are different. List or show the 9 different choices. And then part 2 of the question says, could another person have a choice that is different from one of these 9 choices? Why or why not? And then there's some pictures there to illustrate what they mean. And here is one example of what a student wrote. So take your rubric, your math problem solving rubric, and in a minute, for those of you, if you don't have it handy, I'll flip back to it, but look at this student's work first. Notice how many combinations he listed, or she, I don't know which it is. Notice that in the listing, there's a method apparent. You can tell how the student figured out what to list. And then read his answer to, are there any other combinations? Okay, how would you score this student on that rubric? You think you know what you would do, type it into the chat box. In just a second, I'm going to go back to the rubric. So take one more look at the example. What this student did was list all the vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry combinations possible in order, varying the dish, sugar cone, and regular cone for each, even in the same order, and then he numbered them. And then to answer the question, he said those are all the choices possible, and then actually went on to add more information, which isn't even in our rubric because we don't have an advanced level on that rubric. If they ordered 2 scoops or if they combined them, they could. There are ways to eat different ice cream, but not within the confines of the problem, which is just a brilliant little insight. So let's go back to the rubric. That student clearly understood the problem, and the evidence for that is in the way he listed the choices, varying them systematically to make sure he got them all. That was the solution. And he did actually, in fact, get a correct answer. So that would get you 6 points, 2, 2, and 2. How about that one? Now, the problem did say list or show, so the fact that there aren't words here in and of itself for the first part of the problem is not a problem necessarily. Does this picture have a plan in it that is an accurate representation of the problem? The picture has a systematic approach, all the vanillas, followed by all the strawberries with the dots on them there, followed by all the chocolate. That's the dark ice cream, I'm pretty sure. And then we have cone, dish, and sugar cone for each one. So this actually gets the same problem-solving score for the first part. Now, I didn't answer the second part, and that would be a problem. You'd have to go back and score that separately. But that's a perfectly good answer to the problem, to the question. Let's try this one. Does this student understand the problem? Probably not, because they've associated one kind of ice cream with only one kind of container. And since it's a combinations problem and they didn't combine, our rubric, which I'll flip back to in a minute after I'm giving you a few more seconds to look at the kid's answer, our rubric has a way to talk about that because it's talking about the student's thinking. And the student even reinforces or reiterates that single coupling of one ice cream with one kind of dish in his answer about the second problem. There's nothing different between the choices of ice cream and cones, and there should be if you understood what combinations are. So let me go back to the rubric and show you that when you have a rubric like this with performance level descriptions that actually talk about student thinking, you have a way to encode not only did he get the problem wrong, but that it was understanding the problem and planning the solution issue, because you have criteria that go to that. You might say that part of the problem was misunderstood. He did seem to know that you were supposed to match ice creams with dishes, but he didn't understand it as a combination problem, so it's not a complete understanding of the problem. His solution was to draw some ice cream, and that was not a correct, an inappropriate plan for doing combinations. And of course, because of that, he didn't get the right answer. Nice, simple little math problem-solving rubric. And the nice thing about it is you can use it over and over again with all sorts of different math problems. Okay, let's get past our math. Consider a template for a rubric if you need to make a simple rubric. This is not a rubric. This is generic language. That's why I put that in red. Don't copy that and start using it as a rubric. It's a template that you would use to build a rubric that has levels aimed at proficiency levels. there aren't any criteria there, and we'll put some in a minute, and I'll show you how that can work. But if you have to build a lot of rubrics, which some of you are going to have to do because you're going to be writing assessments, you might want to consider having them all, or many of them, sort of follow a consistent format so that you don't have to go back completely to the drawing board each time. If you do, I would suggest that you pick level 3 to be proficient, complete, correct, and leave a little room for a student to do like what that first math student did, which when he answered that you can't have any more than 9 choices, but if you let people have 2 different kinds of ice cream, you could have more choices. So that includes an extension or an insight that wasn't asked but shows clearly a deep understanding of what combinations in math, how combinations in math work. So that would have been a 4 if it had been this kind of rubric. And if you want to leave a little room for that, make 3 the complete and correct level, 4 the complete and correct plus some sort of extension, exceptional insight, or something that shows more than the student had to do. And 2 then is your partial, kind of understands it. It's not completely lacking, but it isn't complete and correct. And then 1 for the not complete or correct, doesn't understand what's going on. So you would, if you wanted to use that as a template, you could make a rubric out of it, for instance, for the examples I'm going to show you next. Students in 6th grade English Language Arts class had been writing well-structured paragraph in response to a prompt. The learning outcome was, and the teacher actually explicitly told the students, the learning outcome is, I can write a paragraph that does these 4 things: answers the question, has a topic sentence, has detailed sentences that actually relate to that, and has an effective ending. That first one answers the prompt question the teacher had been finding was actually kind of important to add. So here is a rubric that uses that template but incorporates the criteria we just looked at. And I'm seeing now that I left task, I should have written paragraph, has a focus sentence, details, and a conclusion, plus it includes particularly compelling response to the prompt. And then 3 is the paragraph has a focus sentence, details, and conclusion. See that the criteria are in there now. It's not just a template. And that ought to be your second example in your rubrics that will apply to, I think I have 2 student examples for you to try and score for this one. So let's go on and look at that. So the question was, if you were lost in a forest, what would you do? What things could you use to help you? Now, the student just rewrote the prompt as directed. That's what the teacher had asked the students to do. So the student's answer is there. If I was lost in a forest, I would stay calm and try to find the nearest house or ranger station because there's phones there. So go ahead and read the rest of that. Also, I might stay in one spot so someone can find me easier. I would use sticks to make loud noises so animal predators do not come near me. Use leaves and dead branches to make a shelter, and find rocks to throw at nuts in a tree so I could have something to snack on. I will also thumb tinder, missing word there, to make a fire. That's what I would do if I was lost in a forest. So the teacher's criteria, which we're applying in your rubric, are that it actually answers the prompt question, it has a focus topic or topic sentence, it has detailed sentences that relate to the focus, and it has an effective ending. Does this one have all three? Does it answer the question? Some of you, I think, are thinking but not typing into your chat box. I'm going to assume, if you're not typing, that you're thinking. But go ahead and write comments if you have them. Is there a topic sentence? Yes. In fact, the topic sentence actually paraphrases part of the question so that it's clear that that's the topic sentence. Are there detailed sentences that actually relate to the focus? Thanks, Lori. There are a lot of details in that one. And then, is there an effective ending sentence? Well, it's an ending sentence. I don't know how effective it is, but it does restate that this is going to be a paragraph about what I would do in the forest. So it's at least a 3. It could be a 4. Somebody said I would give this a 3. Thank you, Mary. If you wanted to make a case for a 4, you would have to make the case that some of those details were so particularly unusual or compelling or really creative that they rose beyond. For 6th grade, probably not. But again, that might depend on your context and where your particular kids were coming from. I think I would agree with Mary that this is probably a 3. Want to do another one? If you were lost in a forest, what would you do? What things could you use to help you? If I was lost in a forest, I would be very worried that something might get me, and it would be very lonesome without anybody. Things that could help me, that would be, if it would provide firewood. Another big help is I would stones hit together to make wait a minute. Things that I could help me would be wood. It would provide firewood. Another big help is 2 stones to hit together to make a fire. Leaves would help by making a bed, and trees would help for shelter. Those are the things that would help me. And then it looks like he's stuck in as a marginal comment. That's what I would do if I was lost in the forest. Now think, this paragraph is not as good as the other one, but what's not as good is the grammar and usage. Are the ideas in it all that different from the previous one? Answers the prompt, focus sentence, details, ending sentence. So what do you think? A little conflicted, maybe? The focus is there, but it's not quite as clear as the first one. So would you give it a 2? Let's go back to the rubric. Some attempt at a focus sentence, details, and conclusions. Or would you give it a 3 and then work on their grammar separately? See, one of the things that you find out when you try and do this is what you set as criteria have got to exactly match what you're looking for. This teacher was looking for the students to understand the structure of that kind of paragraph. This student does. There wasn't anything in the criteria about writing it in excellent and smooth mechanics. If the teacher had wanted that, there could have been a criterion for mechanics. The question isn't which should there have been. The question is what did you try to teach them, and what do you want to know about that result? So you have to be really careful about the criteria that you put in. Okay, well, we could continue to talk about that. What I would do, I would have a separate scale for the mechanics. And I would tell this student they've got their ideas down and they need to work on their mechanics separately. That's what I would do personally. But again, it depends what you're trying to teach and what you want assessment evidence of. So sometimes for simple tasks, and here's a template, there isn't anything that you can do to go beyond. There is no way that you can, it's just something you have to learn how to do, and you either learn it, or you learn it partially, or you don't have it yet. And in that case, there may not be a level 4 or whatever number it would be on the scale you're using. An example of that is a kindergarten task like making equal sets in math. The students were given little counters and they had to show that sets were equal. And just so that you have a picture of what we're looking at, I'm going to flip to the student work, but then I'm coming back to the rubric to describe it a little bit. This is what they were doing. Can I make two sets of numbers equal? So if a student, the criteria were that the elements of each set were organized and that there was a one-to-one correspondence between elements of each set. And those criteria there is no way to do that even better. The absolute bestest you can do is to do it mathematically right. There is an attempt at organizing elements of each set and showing correspondence between elements of each set so that you can clearly see the kid was going for something but just didn't do it all properly. And then the sort of elements are not organized and there's no correspondence evident at all. The student clearly doesn't understand what it means to make equal sets. So with that rubric in mind, I have two students and they both fit on one slide. Student A did what was on the left. What would you give student A? 3, 2, or a 1? There we go. That's what I would do, Mary. Student A has all the elements of each set in a line, organized. There is clearly a one-to-one correspondence between each element, and the student showed that by setting them up side by side. Now, student B gets the 2 not because they're not side by side. There's nothing about orientation in there. It's perfectly possible to have equal sets top to bottom instead of side to side. But in not lining them up in a straight line and putting them next to each other, he managed to have 5 in the first set and 4 in the second set. So student B is clearly not without any, he knew he had to line them up. He knew all the yellows go together and all the reds go together. He knows what it is to have things in the same set. So it's not no attempt and it's not no understanding. It's an attempt at organizing the elements and showing correspondence, and some of that is evident. It's just not complete. All right. Well, we could go on scoring rubrics for a long time, but I just wanted my rationale for picking what I did was I wanted a variety of subjects, a variety of complexity levels of rubrics. I wanted to show that there are lots of ways to do it. And just saying don't put the directions in the rubrics doesn't mean anybody's telling you what your rubrics have to look like. There are lots of ways to do it, but for heaven's sake, make sure that they go to student thinking, that they go to criteria you should look for as evidence that the student learned your learning outcomes, not followed your directions. And also, please assure everybody that it's not that Sue said directions don't matter. They do. Students have to follow directions all the time, and if they don't, you can give the work back and say, add a picture or put some periods in there, whatever you need, or you can give students a checklist for the directions as part of an assignment sheet if you want, or separately, so that they can check themselves or each other. Not that directions aren't important. It's just that directions and counting facts always lead you astray from, does the student understand what this standard or learning outcome or curricular objective is about? And so I'd love to actually, if this were a table workshop, we'd have some examples and you'd score them and talk about them. But I'm going to move on because in a webinar, it's a little hard to do too much of that. I'd like to change the topic from what the rubric itself looks like to ensuring that when you use the rubric, you're giving it an answer that's reasonable, that is reliable in the sense that if some other teacher looked at the work, they'd grade it the same way, like we just did for our little making equal sets. When the scoring guide is clear, you have a much better chance of agreeing with other raters. When you score one question or task at a time, you end up being able to get in your head, you wrap your head around the rubric. If you have 5 or 6 questions, for instance, and you do all of the questions on one student's paper, then you have to keep switching scoring schemes each time, and your own head gets confused. So it's harder to apply them consistently. Score content separately from other factors. That's why I threw in the little 6th grade writing example. Grammar and spelling can sometimes pull you away from concentrating on what the student is thinking. It's not that grammar and spelling is not important. It's not that you don't need to give the student feedback. It's just that you don't want a sort of mixed, if the teacher was trying to teach the students how to organize paragraphs and the student did that, then the student should be able to know that, and you should know that you did that. And separately, by the way, buddy, you need to work on your spelling and your grammar. If you can, score questions and tasks anonymously. That helps with, excuse me, that helps with getting any of those other things that you know about what a student does out of your head, and it helps you concentrate just on the work. You can't always do that. If you can't do that, simply remember that you're not scoring the kid, you're scoring the work. If you're doing an important assessment, it's worthwhile selecting a few papers. You don't have to have a colleague completely double score a whole set of papers in order to check for consistency. Pull a few, and you will most of the time learn that your colleague would actually score about the same way you would, especially if you teach together and if you work on the same curriculum together. But it's worth checking, because otherwise, whether my student is in Mrs. Smith's class or Mrs. Jones' class might affect the score he gets for the same work, and that's just not okay. And I have a sad story to tell you about that. This particular story is about 2 8th grade teachers in a small middle school, and there were only 2 8th grade language arts teachers in this middle school. And one of the things that they did was have students keep English language arts portfolios all year. And they included writing samples, and they also included things like unit tests, all all sorts of work. And at the end of the year, they evaluated these writing portfolios to make a recommendation to the ninth grade. These kids were going on to another building into high school as to whether the students should be, what level of English the students should be in, honors English or not, mostly. There were a couple of other things, but it was mostly those two. And the writing samples were small, narrative, persuasive, expository, graded with 4-point rubrics. And we did a little experiment. We only took 10 papers from each class, and we had the other teacher score just 10 of her colleagues' papers, and one of the administrators, the assistant principal actually, from the school also scored those 10 on the same 4-point rubrics. Now, they were familiar with the rubrics. They were familiar with the assignments. All they had to do was score 10 more papers. And what was two things were very interesting to me. The one teacher scored her students, the students from her colleague's class got exactly what her colleague had given them in the grade book for real. So there was scoring consistency in that direction. The other direction, though, the colleague scored her own students 1 point higher on average on that 4-point rubric. When there's only 4 points, 1 point's a big deal. But she agreed with her colleague on her own kids' papers. She agreed with her colleague on her colleague's papers. She didn't agree with her colleague on her own kids' papers. She graded them higher. And the assistant principal agreed with the colleague who was the reliable scorer. So that could have a potential of having a kid end up in honors English maybe who shouldn't be there, or a kid end up in a class where they weren't quite up to the work. The other interesting thing to me was that, and I should tell you, this is clip art. This is not a picture of the actual two people I'm talking about. This is just a picture of two teachers. The other thing that I thought was interesting was when we had finished this exercise and went over the results, the look on the teacher's face who had overscored her own kids. She was horrified. She did not realize that she was doing that, and she understood the implications of it. She just really had a little blind spot for the kids that she sort of knew and knew their work and knew what she'd hoped for them. And when I tell this story, I usually use it as a reliability story. Here were some kids who were headed into high school with inaccurate information going with them. But really, if you had been there, for me, probably the thing that would probably make the most importance going into the future was this woman realizing that that was something that she needed to do. She didn't want to be an inaccurate scorer. She had no idea she was doing this. It was, and all it took was a very short time. She read 10 student paragraphs, more than she had to read anyway for her own students. It was a really worthwhile exercise. And after we talked about it and figured out what we were going, it was part of a larger project. We were figuring out what to do with those portfolios, but it really helped, and it didn't take very long at all, less than half an hour. So I would really encourage you to check for consistency of scoring. It's just that important, especially if you're designing assessments, as some of you are with this Teaching as the Core project. They will have consequences for you and consequences for your kids. It just has to be accurate information, and that's doable. Just a couple of joint scoring exercises, and you should be able to figure out what you need to do to make that scoring relatively accurate. Okay. Given the time, and given that this webinar was billed as Rubrics and Other Scoring Schemes, it's time to move on to the other scoring methods. I'm going to spend less time on them than on rubrics, but I did promise to show you some examples of other ways to score things. Checklists, I don't recommend for grading or for scoring in the sense of academic scoring very much. They're most useful for self or peer assessment of following directions, and we've already talked a little bit about that. They are, however, somewhat useful for basic skills, concrete behaviors, or procedures, and some of those can be academic. So, for the sake of completeness, I'm going to show you an example. Here's one. A third grade learning support teacher made a little writing checklist. See, it's just a checklist. It's a whole page, but that's because the yes and no columns are wide. It's just a checklist that the student checks their own. And this third grade student was able to, if you were this student, check down, and if you were this student, you'd know, aha, the thing I need to do is indent. But in addition to giving the student that information, going over the checklist itself helped the student internalize the criteria, capital letters, neat, topic sentence, all of these things for good mechanics. And this student came out pretty well and clearly could do, I mean, this was not a chore beyond the student's capability. The student did it fine. So sometimes checklists are useful for academic behaviors. Here's one for just a regular behavior. This is a poster from the Department of Veterans Affairs. But sometimes in health classes, you learn about how to do things like hand washing. I'm not sure that kind of checklist is useful for grading, but it's certainly useful for assessing your behavior. And here's a checklist that you actually could use for part of an academic assignment that had to do with, in this case, making a wet mount slide. You have to do all these things. You have to do them in order. You can't skip any. And this checklist could be a sort of, it's a procedural checklist. It's not about the quality of the final slide. It's about the procedure you followed to get the final slide. And so this could be partly a learning exercise, and then at the end, a self-assessment. So typically checklists are not scored, but are used for feedback, self, peer, or teacher. If you absolutely need to get a score off a checklist, or if the procedure, for instance, the writing or the wet mount slide, is something that you want students, you're actually teaching the students the procedure, checklists are, if they're scored, it's usually with 1-0 scoring. Like a check would be the 1 and no check would be 0. Although, as I said, that's probably not your best use of checklists. Note that using a checklist assumes that the only measure of quality is that something was done and not how well. And this is why rubrics are usually preferred for scoring. So that's checklists. Then there are rating scales, which are sort of like checklists, except instead of just yes and no, you've got continua under them. If you're going to use a rating scale, I usually recommend that you use a frequency scale, not an evaluative scale. Excellent, good, fair, poor, it's kind of like what was excellent about it. Whereas if you mention a behavior, brings pencil to class or something, the frequency scales at least describe the behavior. Rating scales are sometimes used for measuring attitudes and interests and other survey-type questions. Where you usually see them in schools is in learning skills and citizenship kinds of things. Paid attention in class, always, frequently, sometimes, never. Was willing to listen to other points of view, always, frequently, sometimes, and never. Sometimes you see those sorts of things on report cards. Sometimes you see those sorts of things just on feedback to students. Here's an example of a checklist, a frequency checklist used academically. This is just the first page. This kind of problem, these are temperature and volume problems in high school chemistry, and they had to use Charles's law to figure them out, label their answers and all that good stuff. The actual exercise had about 10 of these problems, so the thing was about 3 pages long, but the other pages didn't have the checklist on this. The checklist was just at the beginning. And this was not for the grade. The grade was the completeness and correctness of the problems. But the students got to check their own problem solving and directions following before they turned it in. So wrote the given information, identified the unknown, converted Celsius to Kelvin, wrote the Charles law equation, rearranged the equation to solve for the unknown, and wrote all the numbers with correct units. And if I were this student, the first thing I'd do would be go back and write the Charles law equation more. I mean, clearly. And I have then seen, as I've showed this to other teachers see that it could easily be adapted for other grade levels and subject matter. Anything you want students to just look at and see how well they did, and then have a chance for amendment of life before they turned it in. A rating scale can really be helpful for that purpose. Point schemes are used for short things like essay test questions that are only a paragraph long or something like that, or show the work math problems. The problem with point schemes is you need a new point scheme for every question, and you can't share them with students ahead of time. So they're not much good for teaching and learning. They're just good for grading, which again is another argument for using the rubrics. But we're going to show you all the point schemes. So here's an example. Fill in the chart below with the name of each of the 3 branches of government and the main purpose of each branch. So they get a possible total of 6 points for naming executive, legislative, and judicial. They get a point for each main purpose. There's a list of the minimum they have to write to get their point. So questions like that can be scored with point schemes. Here's another example of something that could be scored with a point scheme. Some scientists think that the Earth's climate is getting warmer. If these scientists are correct, and the Earth keeps getting warmer for the next 50 years, what will happen to the ocean? Explain why this would happen. And then there's a little essay space, not on my slide, but on the paper there was. If these scientists are correct, what things about the Earth's weather will change? Explain why. If these scientists are correct, what will happen to the plants? And the point scheme would be up to 6 points, a reasonable prediction and an explanation for each ocean's weather and plants. So point schemes are useful for something like that. They're a little easier to use. As somebody pointed out earlier in this webinar, counting things is something people find easier than judging quality. The problem is once the tasks get much beyond this sort of short essay length question, judging quality is what it's about. It doesn't matter if you just put something down that was a prediction for oceans. If you're writing a whole report about it, it better be a high quality description of something that could happen and why it could happen. And for that, you need more than just, yep, they did it. You need the kind of judgment that a performance level description scale on a rubric would allow you to do. So I think I have come back to my summary slide. Use rubrics to match learning outcomes, not directions, and try not to lose sleep over all the students in this whole country who have been failed because of crummy rubrics like that example I gave at the beginning. Use some of the other scoring methods, checklists, rating scales, point schemes, if you have special purposes, something behavioral, or something, a procedure that students have to follow, or you want students to be able to rate the frequency of their doing some work habits. And also, please, please, please do check for consistency of any scoring that has consequences for students, teachers, or schools. I think we have a few more minutes for questions, which I'd be happy to answer. And then I'm going to pass the control of the webinar back to Juliet so that she can end for us.
Thanks, Dr. Sue. So if anybody has any questions, you can type them into the chat box and make sure that your question is being sent to everyone. And we'll just wait a minute or two to see if there are any questions.
Right, and as they're doing that, I can give you back the control, Juliet, because I can speak without the control.
Sure, thank you.
Yes, so there you go.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Are you getting any questions directly, Dr. Burkhart?
No, either everything was very clear or people are still thinking. So,
okay, we'll give folks another minute.
Okay, I got a couple of thank yous. Like that was nice. You're quite welcome. Oh,
and then Mary
separate rubrics. Well, give me a second to be on that soapbox, Mary and Lori. Anytime you have something like that that's important but not what you're trying to teach today, language conventions mechanics is the one you think of as separating out, but there are others in upper grades when students, for instance, have learned a certain report format or bibliography format, or if they've been told that there are certain ways that are good ways to interpret scientific data, or just all sorts of things that students are sometimes taught and expected to put in a toolbox that will be just used all the time. But today's lesson is about something particular in the content. That's the way to handle any of those sort of, Sadler calls those latent criteria. Of course, we want your report on George Washington written with beautiful English, but that's not what I'm grading. But I don't want to ignore the fact that you need to fix your English. So I grade the report, and then I give you the other feedback either on a separate rubric or somehow even just with verbal feedback. And that's a great principle to use so that you don't muddy up the score. And I especially worry about, for instance, supposing a high school teacher has tried to teach students something complicated about the causes of World War I and gets projects in from students, and the grades are tinged with mechanics, which that teacher didn't try to teach them. And, you know, sure, they should write the King's English, but the teacher should want to know, did they learn what I tried to teach them? And should be able to have a measure of that. So separating it out is just exactly what to do.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Okay, with that, I would like to mention, if anybody came to the webinar a little bit late and missed the beginning, or if you have colleagues with whom you'd like to share this webinar, the URL up on the slide that you see is where we keep our materials. The PowerPoint presentation, as well as the recording of this webinar, are going to be posted in the next couple of days on Engage New York at this URL. And also, we are asking that folks provide their feedback on a SurveyMonkey link, and I'm actually typing it into the chat box and sending it right now because you can't copy and paste the URL that's on the slide. But if you click on the link that I sent through the chat box, you can do our very, very quick survey and let us know what you thought and provide any suggestions for anything that you'd like to see webinars on in the future. So thank you so much for providing your feedback, and thank you to Dr. Brookhart for giving us a wonderful, not just webinar today, but webinar series. And with that, I think we can call it a day. So thank you so much, Dr. Sue, and thank you, Dr. Brookhart, Dr. Sue Brookhart, and thank you for everyone else who attended today.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.